The Vikings feared no one. Not the kings of England, whose armies shattered beneath their shield walls. Not the rulers of France, who paid gold simply to be left in peace. Not even the heirs of Charlemagne, the mighty emperor whose empire once stretched across Europe. For decades, their longships ruled the rivers and seas, striking wherever the winds carried them. Their name alone was enough to freeze men's hearts. Monks prayed for mercy at the sound of oars. Kings raised walls and armies that crumbled like sand before them. But in the year 844, the Norsemen sailed farther than ever before. Beyond the familiar coasts of England and Francia, past the Pillars of Hercules, into the heart of the Islamic world. There, they sought plunder greater than anything they had ever known. The treasures of Al-Andalus, the jewel of Muslim Spain. What they expected was silver, silk, and slaves. What they found was fire, steel, and ruin. For the first time in their history, the terror of Europe met an enemy they could not overcome. An empire rich, powerful, and unbroken. And in Seville, the Norsemen learned the bitter taste of true defeat. But how did it come to this? How did the fiercest raiders of the north, who had bent kings and kingdoms to their will, stumble into ruin on the banks of a foreign river? This is the forgotten story of the year 844, the battle that made the Vikings fear the Islamic Empire. To understand the fate of the Vikings at Seville, we must begin with who they were and why they raided. The 9th century was the height of the Viking Age. From the fjords of Norway, the forests of Sweden, and the coasts of Denmark, Norsemen launched expeditions that stretched from the icy seas of Greenland to the golden palaces of Byzantium. They were farmers, traders, explorers, and raiders. By the mid-800s, the Norse had already burned monasteries in England, captured towns in Ireland, and forced Frankish kings to pay them tribute. In Francia, entire armies broke before Viking shield walls. To most of Europe, the Northmen seemed unstoppable. Why did they raid? For wealth, yes. Silver, gold, and slaves filled their ships. But also for honor. In Norse culture, a man's fame was his immortality. Deeds sung in sagas outlasted his bones, and nothing brought glory faster than victories abroad. Thus, by 844, the Vikings were bold, confident, and feared everywhere they went. But success bred arrogance. They began to look beyond familiar hunting grounds, seeking ever richer prizes. Their eyes turned south, to a land spoken of in whispers, where markets overflowed with silver, and rulers commanded armies unlike any they had faced. Al-Andalus, the heart of Muslim Spain. While northern Europe lived in fear of Viking raids, the people of Al-Andalus thrived under a very different power. The Emirate of Cordoba, founded in the 8th century after Muslim armies swept across Iberia, Al-Andalus had become a jewel of the Islamic world. By the time Abd al-Rahman II ruled, Cordoba and its surrounding lands stood as one of the most advanced societies in Europe. The contrast with the fractured kingdoms of the north was stark. Where Francia and England were divided by rival lords and weak kings, Al-Andalus was united under strong leadership. The emir commanded not only soldiers but wealth from trade routes stretching into Africa, the Middle East, and beyond. Its cities glittered with prosperity. Cordoba, the capital, was a center of learning, poetry, and science. Seville, with its strategic river access, was a thriving hub of trade. Markets bustled with silk, spices, and silver. Strong fortifications guarded towns, and standing armies, drilled and experienced, stood ready to defend them. Religion also played its role. For Christians of the north, Viking raids were a test of faith endured with prayer. For Muslims in Al-Andalus, resistance was a duty. Framed as jihad, a defense of their land and faith against invaders. To the Norsemen, who saw fragmented and fearful responses elsewhere, Al-Andalus may have looked like just another rich land waiting to be plundered. But beneath its wealth lay steel and unity. When word spread in 844 that longships had appeared on the southern coasts, raiding towns and villages, the shock was immense. But the emirate was no stranger to war. Where northern kings bought peace with silver, Abd al-Rahman II prepared to buy it with blood. The stage was set. On one side, the terror of Europe. On the other, the lion of the south. In the summer of 844, the Norsemen gathered their ships. Perhaps 50, perhaps more. Long, sleek vessels carved with dragons and serpents, their sails painted red and white. From the coasts of France, they set their course southward, beyond the waters they knew well. chasing whispers of wealth in a strange and distant land. Here, they struck first at smaller settlements along the northern coast of Spain. Villages burned, churches were looted. Survivors carried stories inland of pale-skinned giants wielding axes and swords. Yet these were only the first sparks of the fire. The fleet pressed on, rounding the western edge of Iberia, and entered the southern waters of the Atlantic. At last, they came to the mouth of the Guadalquivir River. For the Vikings, rivers were doorways, paths that led to the heart of kingdoms. And this river led straight to one of the richest cities in the Islamic world, Seville. The longships glided upriver, their carved prows cutting the current. Farmers on the banks stared in disbelief at the sight of so many ships, their sails billowing like the wings of demons. To the people of Al-Andalus, these strangers were a nightmare made flesh. Neither Christian nor Muslim, but raiders from a frozen world to the north. When the Norsemen landed, they wasted no time. Outlying towns were plundered, their defenders cut down. The Vikings moved with brutal efficiency, seizing food, treasure, and captives. But their eyes were fixed on something greater, the shining prize that awaited upriver, Seville, a city of wealth, markets, and stone walls. A city that had never seen warriors like these. The Norsemen sharpened their blades, tightened their shields, and prepared to take it. For them it was destiny. For Seville, it was the beginning of fire. The Vikings swept into Seville like a storm. Their longships lined the riverbanks, warriors leaping ashore with axes, swords, and spears gleaming in the sun. Shields slammed together as they pushed into the heart of the city. Seville had never faced an enemy like this. Its markets bustled with merchants, its streets filled with townsfolk, not soldiers. The defenders fought bravely, but the Norsemen were too fierce, too sudden. Within hours, panic tore through the city. The raiders surged into homes and marketplaces, tearing down doors, dragging out treasures. Smoke rose from the rooftops as fire spread from quarter to quarter. Cries of fear mixed with the war shouts of the invaders echoing against the stone walls. The Vikings took everything they could carry. Silver coins and jewelry, silks and spices from far-off lands. Slaves, men, women, and children bound and dragged to the ships. The scent of burning wood and flesh filled the air as Seville became their prize. For the Norsemen, it seemed a glorious victory. Another city fell, another tale to boast of when they returned north. They feasted on stolen food, drank from looted cups, and mocked the cries of the captives. Around their fires they laughed and sharpened their blades, certain that the city was theirs to keep. But far to the east, in the great city of Córdoba, word reached Emir Abd al-Rahman II. Seville had been sacked, its people slaughtered, its treasures plundered, its streets defiled by northern raiders. For the emir, this was not merely an attack. It was an insult to the strength of Al-Andalus, a wound to the pride of the Islamic Empire in Spain. He would not pay tribute. He would not bow as the kings of the north had done. He would answer with fire and steel. The emir called upon his generals, summoning both professional soldiers and loyal volunteers. From Córdoba and beyond, men gathered, archers, spearmen, and, most fearsome of all, the Andalusian cavalry, warriors on swift horses, trained to strike like lightning and vanish like shadows. Day by day, the host swelled. Black banners unfurled beneath the blazing sun. The clatter of armor and weapons echoed through the streets as the army marched south toward Seville. The people cheered their emir, for they knew this was no simple raid to be endured. This was a test of the empire's strength. Meanwhile, in Seville, the Vikings remained overconfident. They thought themselves unchallenged, their ships filled with loot, their camps echoing with drunken laughter. They had faced kings before and crushed them. Why should these new foes be any different? But the emir's scouts had already encircled the river. Watchful eyes tracked the Norsemen's every move. Bridges were fortified, roads cut off. Escape would not be easy. When the Andalusian army finally descended upon Seville, it did so with thunder. The ground shook beneath the hooves of cavalry. Horns split the air. The banners of Abd al-Rahman's forces blackened the horizon. The Norsemen had come seeking plunder. What they found instead was an empire awakened, united, and ready for war. The hunters were about to become the hunted. The riverbanks trembled with fury. On one side, the Norsemen, hardened raiders, tall and fierce, their shields painted with symbols of dragons and gods. On the other, the forces of Al-Andalus, cavalrymen armored in mail, archers poised, spearmen standing in disciplined ranks beneath the banners of the Emir. 2 worlds, 2 empires, 2 ways of war. The Vikings fought as they always had, with shock and savagery. They formed their shield wall, axes raised, spears thrusting outward, roaring their war cries to frighten the enemy. To them, battle was chaos, a storm of blood and steel. But Abd al-Rahman's army fought with strategy. The cavalry surged forward in disciplined waves, circling the Viking flanks, cutting them off from the river. Arrows darkened the sky, striking down men who had no armor to protect them. Where the Norsemen charged headlong, the Andalusians countered with precision, drawing them into traps, striking, then retreating before they could be caught. The ground quickly turned to slaughter. Viking axes cleaved helmets and shields, blood spraying across the dust. Andalusian spears pierced through shield gaps, driving men back step by step. Horses trampled the fallen. The river itself grew red as bodies fell into its waters. The Vikings roared in defiance, refusing to break, but for the first time, their fury was met with a force greater still. They were not facing frightened villagers or desperate monks. They were facing an empire, disciplined, well-armed, and determined to defend its land. Hours passed. The Norsemen grew weary, their shield wall buckling under the relentless cavalry charges. Fires spread through the Viking camp. The cries of the wounded filled the air. Still, they fought on. Their sagas had taught them that to die in battle was glory. But as arrows rained down and cavalry swept their ranks, even the bravest among them began to falter. The final blow came when the Andalusians cut off their escape to the river. The longships, the lifeblood of every Viking raid, now lay beyond their reach. The Norsemen were trapped, hemmed in on all sides. Some tried to fight their way out. Others fled into the countryside, only to be hunted down by horsemen. Many were captured alive, dragged in chains before the commanders of Al-Andalus, and with that, the battle was decided. The invincible Vikings, who had stormed kingdoms and toppled cities, were broken on the banks of the Guadalquivir. For the first time in their history, fear entered the hearts of the Norsemen. The clash was over, but the terror had only just begun. The once mighty Vikings, raiders who had struck fear into all of Europe, now found themselves bound in chains, dragged like cattle through the streets of Seville. Their longships, their freedom, their pride, all lost to the might of Abd al-Rahman's empire. For the survivors, there would be no mercy. The Emir understood that this was more than a battle. It was a message, and that message would be written in blood. One by one, the captured Norsemen were brought forth. Some were beheaded, their heads mounted on pikes for the people of Seville to see. Others were hanged from the city's gates, their lifeless bodies swaying as a warning to any who might dare follow. Still others were burned alive, their screams echoing across the river. To the Andalusians, this was justice. To the Vikings, it was horror. Never before had they faced an enemy so ruthless, so unafraid to match their own cruelty and exceed it. The raiders who had once mocked the prayers of monks now became the subject of whispers and curses, their defeat celebrated as divine retribution. The humiliation cut deeper than any sword. The Norse reputation, the myth of their invincibility, had been shattered. Word of the massacre spread quickly. Survivors who managed to escape carried tales northward, their voices trembling as they spoke of cavalry charges that crushed their ranks, of fire and iron raining down upon them, of brothers burned or hanged like criminals. In the longhouses of Scandinavia, such stories were not sung as sagas of glory. They were warnings. The name Seville became a mark of dread, a reminder that even the fiercest raiders could be broken. Fear, once a weapon wielded by the Norse, now turned against them. It took root in their hearts, in their memory, in their very legends. For the first time, the Vikings had learned what it meant to lose, utterly, shamefully, and without hope of vengeance, and the world had seen that the terror of Europe could bleed. But battles do not end with the clash of swords. They linger in the silence that follows, in the ash, in the ruin, in the bitter taste of loss. And for the Vikings, the silence after Seville was more dreadful than the battle itself. The fires of Seville burned low. The screams of the dying had faded, replaced by silence, the silence of victory for Al-Andalus, and the silence of ruin for the Norsemen. Where the Vikings had once feasted, their bodies now lay in heaps. or their remains hung as grim trophies upon the city gates. For Emir Abd al-Rahman II, this triumph was more than a battle won. It was a declaration. He had not only defended his people, he had crushed the invaders so thoroughly that their terror would never again reach so far south. His rule was strengthened, his prestige unshaken, and his people reassured that their empire was no easy prey. But the victory did not end in Seville alone. Across Al-Andalus, word spread quickly. The raiders from the north had been humbled. Farmers, merchants, and townsfolk who had trembled at the sight of the dragon-proud ships now took heart. The Vikings were not gods of war. They were mortal men who bled, who died, who could be defeated. For the Norsemen, the cost was unbearable. Dozens of ships were lost. Hundreds of warriors slain, captured, or executed. Their proud venture into the heart of Muslim Spain had ended not with treasure, but with disgrace. Survivors limped back to their homelands, carrying with them not loot, but stories of horror, of cavalry that struck like thunder, of arrows that rained down like nightfall, of comrades burned alive before the eyes of the city. These tales spread across the halls of Scandinavia. They reached Denmark, Norway, and beyond. They carved themselves into memory. The fearless raiders who had mocked priests and kings now spoke in hushed tones of the emir's vengeance. Seville had become a scar upon the Viking soul, and yet, from this scar, change was born. No longer would the Norsemen recklessly strike deep into Muslim lands. They learned to be cautious, to weigh risk against reward. Their later expeditions into the Mediterranean were marked by strategy, not blind confidence. Fear had tempered their fury. For the Islamic Empire in Spain, the aftermath was a golden moment. A reminder that they were not merely survivors of raids, but victors over them. Their defenses were strengthened, their pride renewed, their empire secure. The river that had once carried dragon ships now flowed quietly again, reflecting the walls of a city rebuilt. But for the Norsemen, its waters would forever hold the memory of fire, defeat, and fear. The age of raiding would continue. But never again would the Vikings forget the lesson of Seville. The year 844 left a scar not only upon the Vikings, but upon history itself. Seville had become more than a city sacked. It became the place where the Norsemen's myth of invincibility was shattered. Until then, the raiders had seemed unstoppable. They had burned the monasteries of Lindisfarne, humbled the Franks, and plundered kingdoms with ease. Their longships carried terror wherever rivers flowed. But in Seville, they met their match, an empire rich, powerful, and unbroken. For the Islamic world of Al-Andalus, the battle became a proud tale of triumph. Chroniclers recorded how the emir's cavalry had driven the pagans into the ground, how justice had been served upon the invaders, how the city had risen from its ashes stronger than before. To the people of Spain, it was proof that faith and steel could overcome even the fiercest foe. For the Vikings, however, the memory cut deep. Though they continued to raid, they never forgot the humiliation. They spoke of the executions, the fires, the thunder of hooves that broke their shield walls. It was whispered in their longhouses that not even Odin's chosen could withstand the wrath of Al-Andalus. In time, the legacy of 844 changed the very way they waged war. They grew more cautious, more strategic. No longer did they plunge blindly into lands they did not understand. Instead, they studied their enemies, learned from their defeats, and adapted. It was this resilience that allowed the Norsemen to endure, to continue carving their name into history, from the rivers of Russia to the gates of Constantinople. Yet Seville remained a reminder that even the wolves of the north could bleed, that even the fiercest terror could be broken. And in that moment of defeat, the world glimpsed a truth often forgotten. No empire, no army, no legend is ever beyond the reach of fate. And so the tale of 844 comes to its end. The year the wolves of the north sailed into the heart of Spain, only to be broken upon its steel. Seville became their nightmare, their scar, their warning. The Norsemen returned to their frozen fjords carrying no treasure, no triumph, only fear. Fear of the thunder of cavalry, fear of fire and iron, fear of a power they could not bend to their will, yet still the Vikings endured. They would raid again, sail again, carve sagas into stone and memory. But never again would they forget the day their invincibility was shattered. The Vikings feared no one. Not kings, not empires, not even the heirs of Charlemagne. But in 844, they faced a power unlike any other. The day they struck Seville was the day they learned that even legends can fall. And this is but one saga among many. From the frozen fjords to the gates of Constantinople, from raiders to kings, the Norse carved a legacy that still echoes today. If you hunger for more raids, more battles, more forgotten tales of Viking fury and fate, then join us. Stand with the shield wall, subscribe and enter the Longhouse, where the age of the Vikings is brought back to life. One story at a time.